Aha, I think we may now have a signal, audio, and video should be working. Apologies, everyone, for that technical glitch. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but the good old start the thing again seems to have worked, at least from what I can see on my screen and around me. Let me know in the chat if the audio is good, if it is accompanied by video, if you can hear it in both ears. And a very warm and slightly belated welcome to another For the Love of Comics Sunday live stream. I can see the chat on both the screens, which is a good indicator that I have finally been able to connect. Those of you who just joining, welcome. You didn't miss much at all. Those of you who've been here for a while, thank you for your patience. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it is in the world. I'd love to know where everyone is from. Glad to see so many people in the chat already. It's going by really fast. Wow, excellent. There's 27 people watching right now. That's great. Thank you, everyone, for joining me this evening for what I am hoping is going to be a slightly different but still quite, I hope, enjoyable live stream in which I wanted to really have a discussion and I wanted to say a couple of things myself. But it isn't really a rant or a take, and that's what I was writing in the notes. It's just something I've been thinking about for a while, and I thought that I could get your take on it as well. And it's going to follow a different structure. So if this is your first time here, a very warm welcome. If you are long-time viewers and this is not your first live stream, welcome back, irrespective of whether you're watching it live right now on Sunday night here, India time, or if you're watching a recording of it later. I hope it's equally fun. So just saying hello to everyone. Everyone's going by really fast. Comic Crack, good to see you. Stuart, good to see you. I'll have to put my glasses on. We've got Salil, we've got Javed, we've got JG, we've got Tinnis, we've got Rosen, we've got Stuart, we've got Karthik, Sarita, hello, Oroa, Red Cloud, Donovan, Sloan, welcome everyone. Hope it's a good time for everyone. I know that there are viewers all over, so it's always going to be a tough time to pick. It's going to be impossible to pick a time that works for everyone. But I've seen over the months that Sunday night seems to be a good one for people. Sunday night India time, evening time, late Sunday night India time, I should say, and morning in the US. But let's see. I'm also happy to see that the live streams have been popular in their recorded form, with people catching up on it and people watching in parts, because they do tend to go long. But I enjoy doing them. I enjoy not just the live conversation, but also the comments and the conversation that comes afterwards, which I think is fantastic. So thank you very much, no matter how you watch these live streams and how you interact. Hello from Mumbai. So we've got more people. We've got Charbak Dipta. We've got Anusha. Great to see you. Welcome. And the reason I was saying that this is slightly different is because this live stream isn't going to be about specific comics per se, although I did pick up a handful of them just to have something on the table, but more about Phantom Fool is asking, isn't it really late in India? Yes, it's about 11:30. It's slightly after 11:30 p.m. on Sundays, which is a good time for me because I'm a bit of a late night owl anyway, and I get all the stuff that's been required through the weekend taken care of before I can relax as a final thing for my weekend. It's a final goodbye to the weekend, this live stream, when I do it on Sunday night. So I've kind of enjoyed it, and people seem to like this time as well. So, what is this particular live stream about? There are a couple of things that I wanted to talk about, and then I wanted to get your take on it. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to just talk for a while, which is I'm not going to be looking at the chat because it's very easy for me to get derailed, and those of you who've been on my live streams before know that. So I tend to lose track of what I'm saying because of the entertainment in the chat. I'm going to keep myself focused away from the chat. So if anyone is joining after I've said my hellos, the rest of you in chat, please make them feel welcome and explain to them the situation that I have now blinded myself to the chat for right now. That's because I did want to talk a little bit without any biases from other people people's opinions and thoughts and sort of honestly express myself and then look at what other people are saying and then maybe get a little bit into the details or maybe not, or maybe we'll just talk about particular comics and use examples to make our points. But I wanted to talk about, and as I gave the title for this video, which I'm not sure is a good title, so maybe all of you can help me figure out a better title for it by the time this stream ends. The title I gave this video is Overrated versus Underrated. And what I really wanted to talk about is the way people talk. So yes, it's going to be a bit of a vocabulary-based conversation. But of all the terms that people commonly use when critiquing or reviewing art, and by art, I mean comics, movies, video games, music, what have you, any form of art, one of the terms that I like the least, I would have to say, is quote unquote overrated. I'm just not a fan of the term when it comes to talking about art. And there are a couple of big reasons for it, and there are a couple of small reasons for it. And maybe we'll get into the small reasons, maybe we won't. But of the big reasons, the first one is that it just to me comes across as a little obnoxious. It sounds arrogant and it sounds dismissive, overrated. Because I think anytime we are discussing art, it's understood that we are talking about an opinion. We are expressing an opinion. And an opinion is always personal. So it's always subjective. Now, reviews, whether they're published online, whether they're published in print, whether they're on YouTube, on a blog, on Reddit, reviews are just published opinion. So when we say something like that book was boring, I think it's understood generally. It's understood that what is implied or what is meant by that is I thought the book was boring, or I felt bored, or I was bored. That subjectivity is sort of parenthetical but implied, and I think for the most part clear. So when reviews use that language, that implication I think is part of that. So using the term overrated becomes sort of a final concluding judgment that dismisses all other opinions and therefore all other experiences with that work as simply wrong. So the term overrated instead, it seems to me, becomes a celebration of the speaker, of the reviewer, about how they can see through everything and they can see that the emperor is wearing no clothes and everyone else who disagrees with them is somehow mesmerized or manipulated. But I think even more than that superiority, which is the first major reason why I don't really like this term, I think more than that superiority, the other reason that I don't like overrated is because it seems more concerned with opinions on a work rather than with the work itself. It's a reaction to what other people are saying. So to call something overrated is to simply say it's not as good as everybody else says it is. It's sort of the way I look at it and the way I think I read it. So the focus then becomes not the work of art that you're talking about, but what, the focus becomes on what everyone else says. Now, I think I can still see overrated as being used in a cultural commentary context when we're having generalized conversations about people, about readers, audiences, things like that. Because, and it's fine over there to me because at least the topic of conversation in such contexts is opinions. So when talking about opinions, I can still see it, it still sounds arrogant to me, but I can still see it being used. But when talking about a work of art itself, not on culture, not on things, when talking about the work of art itself, I don't necessarily see how it belongs. I don't see why it's being used. So whenever I come across it, it usually strikes me as being lazy or immature, as in it's a swooping generalization statement and one could do better. So that's my opinion on the term overrated. Interestingly enough, I find the term underrated quite pleasurable. I really like it. I'm a fan of it. I've used it often. I've often used overrated myself, and I'm not 100% happy about all of the times that I've used it and the ways that I've used it. But underrated is a term I really like. Now, this to me, I think, and to most of you, might sound immediately as either let's say at best it is inconsistent to me, and at worst I'm being hypocritical, because at the surface level underrated should suffer from the same critique that I had for overrated, that it is dismissive of everybody else's opinion and it is more interested in how something is viewed rather than the thing itself. So, applying the same reasons or applying the same rationale as I did to overrated, I shouldn't be a fan of this term either. I should have at least an equal disdain for them. But I find that to not be the case. And it's that inconsistency that made me wonder why. And I think there are actually, outside of the superficial, fundamental differences in the way that these words there's a fundamental difference in what these words mean, but there's a fundamental difference in the way they're used and the larger contexts and implications of these words. And I think they're not at all the same, even though they appear to be the same. And again, I think there are a number of reasons why, or there are a number of reasons to give as support, but one of the most clear things that it seems to me is that overrated is about exclusion sort of distinction. It's almost saying you don't need to read this, or that's not worth watching, or don't listen to what everyone else says. It's not worth your time. Maybe I'm wrong about that. And, this is something that I'd love to know if people think about that. But if someone says, what did you think of that? And someone says, oh, I thought it was overrated. Are they responding to someone who's also familiar with the work or not? I suppose would be one of those questions. But it does seem to me to be about no. Underrated, on the other hand, seems to be about yes. It's worth your time. Don't listen to everyone else. Check it out for yourself. And I think that fundamental sort of, and of course, I'm being very, very generalized over here, but the initiative to say something is overrated is to dismiss something as not worthy, as not worthwhile. And the initiative to say underrated is to say yes worthy, yes worthwhile. So I think there's there's one big difference over there. And I think more or alongside that sort of inclusivity versus exclusivity, overrated, as a corollary to that or related to that, overrated seems to be, and again, this is my take on it, overrated seems to be the end of a conversation. There's nothing more that needs to be said about it. Why? Because already too much has been said. There's too much conversation out there. The buzz is wrong. Whatever I mean by overrated, I mean there's already too much of it out there, and there doesn't need to be any more. Underrated, again, is the opposite of that. It says there needs to be more conversation about this. There needs to be more discussion about this, or whatever has existed isn't enough. And that again strikes me as, again, in the usage of it, as a fundamental difference between these two terms. And going along these lines, it seems to me that if I say something is underrated, I'm talking about other people's opinions. So this is the second point, that both of them seem to be obsessed with people's opinions more than the work. So if I say overrated, it's not as good as everyone says it is. If I say underrated, it's not as bad as everyone says it is. I'm still concerned about what everyone says more than the book or the movie or the video game, it seems to me. But beyond the check it out for yourself and beyond its worth time, the third thing, it seems to me, that separates these two is that when I say something is underrated, I'm not dismissing the opinions of people. And this is where I think it becomes interesting, because we really start focusing on the over and under, but also on the rated part of it. So the fundamental question becomes, what do I mean by overrated? Do I ever use overrated for something that is not famous? Do I ever use overrated for something that isn't either critically, award-winning or box office or money-earning? Isn't there a standard beyond which, under which you wouldn't call something overrated? Because it would need to have gotten to a certain rating in order for you to think that's too much. Underrated, similarly, would be about what has been the verdict and is that what it deserves. So to call something underrated could be not necessarily saying it's great or even that is worth your time. It could simply be saying that reaction is too vitriolic. And similarly, we could flip that around and say, well, overrated might be saying, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying this is too much hype. This is too much praise. Once again, if you're talking about cultural conversations, if you're talking about audiences, then fine. But what does that have to do with the work itself? The inherent judgment of the work intersecting with opinion maybe the thing that we find to be the sticking point with both of these terms. Once again, I don't think it's actually exactly the same, because overrated is a dismissal of other opinions as being too high, too much, but that means that they're wrong to have that high an opinion of something. If I say someone is wrong to have too low an opinion of something, it's not quite the same thing as saying they are wrong. In fact, with many underrated works, we might find ourselves agreeing with the criticisms and the critique. We just don't think it's worth docking that many points as you're docking because of other things or because of other values, and we're actually looking at a balancing act. Overrated, once again, seems to be more of a full stop. The conversation is over. There, it's just wrong to think that's the greatest thing. That means that you are completely wrong. Whereas underrated doesn't say that you're completely wrong. It seems to me, it says maybe you just want a second look. Maybe you can just think about this a little more differently, because it's so engaged in continuing the conversation or burrowing deeper rather than sealing it off. It seems to be, once again, a very different term from the term overrated. So in order to look at this and discuss this, is what I thought it would be a good idea to do over here. In order to do that, I'd be interested in thinking about and talking about what do people call overrated, underrated, and how, and this is, these are the couple of questions that I've come up with, how is underrated different from underread or underknown? Because I can say something is, or some work or some creator is criminally underknown, or undersung is also a term, and what are the intersections of these terms? Because somewhere I might think underrated isn't about something that no one has seen, because I might still think that something that no one has seen would be something that would be rated very high were people only to see it. Whereas underrated might be, no, people have seen it, people have read it, people have experienced this thing, and they've passed a verdict which I think falls short of something. So there's a difference, I think, between something being known and something being read, and something being experienced and that being talked about, or something just not being known at all. And that's why I think I would use underread, underknown, undersung. Undersung is a little bit of a gray area, differently than underrated, which is the opinion itself is something that I'm factoring in with underrated that I wouldn't be if someone had never heard of something or someone that I'm talking about. So over here, I think is a good place for me to pause and see if the chat has anything interesting for me. My eyesight is getting worse by the day. So one thing that if you're talking amongst yourselves, that's great. If you want to direct something at me, if you could tag at FTLOC or at For the Love of Comics, then I'll see it sort of pop out. And if you have a question, if you could just start with the letter Q so I know that it's a question and I won't be looking at other things. But I'll pause over here to see what do you think about the terms overrated and underrated. What do you think about my opinions on this that I've I don't know how well I've expressed them though, but the ones that I've tried to express right here. All right, let's see what we have. Overrated, Phantom Fool says, to me just means that the reviewer's opinion is worse than what they perceive other people's opinion to be. Yeah, exactly. It's talking about other people's opinions, not really the work itself. Comic Crack is getting me on the couch. Did this come up for you just now, recently? Is it something? No, it's just something. It's something I've always thought about, but I've also realized that I don't use the word and do use the word, and I make a distinction. And I was just wondering why I make that distinction. But what was really interesting to me is, and I'll get into this later, is because I came at it from the term underrated, which is a term I liked, and I wondered why I liked it when I don't like overrated. So I kind of came about it backwards. The overuse of overrated, yes, I really, that might be another thing, Comic Crack. It's not so much something come up recently, and it definitely doesn't come up in academic discourse or even highfalutin reviews of a particular diction, but in general conversation and in conversation that we have online, etc., I have seen it crop up, and I do think it is overused because I think not all contexts warrant it. So when I use the term overused, it's kind of mixing in with misuse. So if you overuse something, you're generally going to end up using it when it shouldn't be used. So misuse and overuse to me are about the same thing. So I definitely agree that it is a little misused and it is a little overused. Would you say the term is overrated? I was waiting for who was going to ask me that question. Would you say the term overrated is overrated? If we can take frequency of how often people use it as a sign of how high their rating is, then yes, maybe, but now I'm talking about society. But I don't necessarily think that just because someone does it often or someone does it all the time means that they think very highly of it. It could just be reflex, it just could be shorthand, it could be something you don't think about. The most mundane things, the most boring things can be things that we do very often without necessarily giving them a high rating. In fact, maybe we only give high ratings to things that we do very, very rarely and they're a treat for us. So I don't know. I don't know if overuse of the term means it's overrated. Overrated art by over-opinionated people. Now, over-opinionated. Now, over, I think, is just a funny little thing to have. And that's why I wonder, because over and under usually go hand in hand. If you don't like a term that you says over something, you may not like a term that says under something. Although I haven't thought about that in such detail, so I don't know. Whereas one term that I use quite often is overthink. And I've gone back and forth on overthink, where I used to be like, that's just a stupid term used by people who don't like to think. How can you overthink something? But I realize how blindered that is, because you can definitely overthink things. It means different things in different contexts. So sometimes I think overthink is a term that's used when you want to say second guess. Don't second guess yourself. Go with what you've decided. Go with what you've thought. So that is usually represented as overthink. Whereas if you just give something thought, can you give something too much thought? It's a tough question, but we're not talking about overthink. We're talking about overrated. But yes, over opinionated, overblown. There's different language out there, and different parts of it rankle or soothe me differently. Underrated is distinct from overrated because it is at least grounded in appreciation. Yes. Now, that's what I'm saying as well, and I completely understand that can come across as wishy-washy to the like, oh, just because it's appreciation doesn't mean it's better. Critique is critique, whether it's negative or positive. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm prescribing a sort of feel-good approach, that let's use the words that make us feel good and let's not use the words that don't make us feel good. It's hopefully not coming across as such a 1984 type of situation. Rather, I think when talking about art and talking and having conversations, I am a fan of the continuing conversation. I'm a fan of the going back and forth and listening to a variety of different opinions without necessarily thinking about them as an attack. So, ever since I've been making videos on this channel, I've heard so many great, fantastic opinions that are not my opinions, that I don't agree with, but I love the way they are articulated. I love the analysis that they're doing. The conclusions they're reaching are different from my conclusions, and they have their reasons, and I have, but I can see them. When I think about terms like overrated, I think about them as amputations to conversation. I think about them as having that arrogance and having that dismissal of every other opinion as being somehow less knowledgeable than you. And I don't think that way about underrated. And that's my curiosity, is why not? Because what I'm saying is it's not just about the positivity and the negativity. It's about the conversation, and it's about the contexts in which these words are used. Why did I use the word overrated, and why did I use the word underrated? What conversational and what discourse oriented implications do those phrases have? I think that's where I'm settling as my clear, distinct reason for thinking about these words differently. Do you think overrated because is better used than just overrated? Maybe. Again, it depends on the context. If I'm talking about the Academy Awards, and I'm talking specifically from the point of view of my opinions of who deserved to win something over something else, first of all, I've decided to buy into this whole pageant and things like that. I want to be invested in it. So it's like professional wrestling or sports or anything like that. You choose to buy into what you want to be invested in. And then if someone wins an award or someone gets a, and that is not what you think, then you'll be like, yes, it's overrating, because that award means more than my opinion. And I think that is key. And I think that's a good point to bring up, because I do think that's part of the term overrated. Because not only are we talking about people's opinions, we're talking about the weight. So you have an opinion, I have an opinion. One way of saying something is overrated is by number. There are 400 of you who think this is wonderful, and I'm the only person I can find who thinks it's terrible. So I can say it's overrated because it should be 50-50. There should be some people on my side. How come everyone's on that side? That's one way. The other way is awards and things in magazines and journals and best of lists and how many game of the year awards did you get. So that kind of appreciation, whether it comes from a guild or whether it comes from popular vote or any combination of these things, is usually one of the things that someone reacts to. But that's because they feel, obviously, I can understand why, but we feel that, well, that or Eisner or that Oscar, it means more than what I say on my blog or on my YouTube channel. So that's overrating, because if it was just about all of us here and writing blogs, but where do you draw the line? Well, they have a viewership of 500,000 and they have a readership of 1 million, and so overrating, it's always going to be based on something that one is reacting to. My point, I think, is it's not necessarily the work. It doesn't seem to be the work. It seems to be, apart from the arrogance, apart from the dismissal that anyone who likes something that I don't like has to be wrong, has to be somehow less intelligent. Apart from that, there is this idea of, as I was saying, this idea of, well, now I've lost my now I've lost my second point, is that it's not just the question of the arrogance, but it's the question of whether you're going to read more and whether you're going to wait. I'm just going to see if I had written it down somewhere. Yeah, the idea of, yeah, sorry, I got distracted because I looked at the comments. The idea of conversation and the idea of opinion, that am I talking about opinion or am I talking about a work of art? If I'm talking about opinion, to something that everyone says is bad, it's also talking about opinion. So what makes underrated different from overrated, I think, is where we've gotten to. Salil says, my concern is that overrated tends to influence and impact people's minds before they have ever been exposed to any form of creative art. And these could not even be from real experts. Well, yes. And now the reasons behind saying overrated, I think this is where we get into this gray area where we can start supposing, why is someone calling something overrated? Do they have an insecurity of what they know? You know, someone who doesn't know anything about science, medicine, finds modern medicine overrated. Why? Because everyone takes that and there is no other option for you or something like that. I mean, now I think we'll get into that place where I could try to guess at why someone uses that term. And I have in the past as well. I think maybe when I think about what the effect is, then I have something more concrete, because trying to guess at why is a little bit more abstract. So at least looking at the language, but I get your point, is like, if something is overrated means you don't need to check it out. It's not worth your time, as I was saying. So you never get to try it if you listen to someone saying that it's overrated. Yes. And if someone says you're underrated, and here is my question to all of you then, is that what piques your curiosity more? If someone calls something overrated, or if someone calls something underrated? Because I think for me, the answer is clear that it is the underrated. As soon as someone says underrated, I'm more curious, and I'll get into why, but I'd like to know what other people think. Comic Trek says both terms seem to be more concerned with what other people think. Yes, but I still think that underrated is a good term, because it's not actually about what other people think, even though it sounds like it is. That's I think if I have to this ramble any thesis at all, it's why we say underrated is very different from why we say overrated. And it's not technically true that underrated is more concerned with other people's opinions than with the work of art itself. That's the interesting thing to me, is I think overrated is a term that's more interested in opinion than the work. But I think underrated is interested in the work, not the opinion. And that's the real wrestling thing that I want to do. Shanton thinks most things are just appropriately rated. Definitely. I think the word rated itself should come in under scrutiny. Sleepy Reader, good to see you. Josh says that I know he won't ever do this, but after the great discussion inside Human Thinking, he ends the stream with, this series is overrated. Yes. Well, I all the bad jokes have crossed my mind, including, starting with whether the word itself is overrated or not. Bringing expectations on a reading experience. Yes, I know. This is where we start, though. Alejandro says, I tend to love checking out more underrated because the work is overrated. Seems to me to be always work that I already know of and very famous. Yes, this is very, very crucial. Off my shelves, I'm instantly suspicious, he says, for over, under, and I look for things that investigate both. Yes, absolutely. Now, I want to be clear. There are a lot of things that are clickbaity, and there are things that, sort of draw your lizard brain, and anyone who does YouTube, etc., and has at least a passing familiarity with this, and everyone online, I think, is aware, at least these days. So what works as an attention grabber, I think, has definitely populated polluted, I should say, our vocabulary and how we interact and how we talk. I've often, commented on the fact that people, and I'm going to sound like a real old man now, but it often seems to me that the comments that I see from people online, etc., wouldn't be things that you would say face to face to somebody. And I'm not trying to, say that I've had some sort of insight that no one has. I understand that we all know this. You wouldn't say it face to face. So that interaction seems to me to be a different interaction. So when we take the vocabulary, that's all about grabbing attention and, sort of creating a shock or creating, and we take that, we absorb that constantly, the more we're reading this kind of thing, the more it enters into how we talk and it's how we review things, because that's how we read something written that was supposed to be to get clicks. So there's definitely an intemperate part of the language that is absolutely purposeful. But I'm going to say in good faith, I will say that I'm going to dismiss anyone who's using overrated to get attention. Because again, I don't want to get into, the psychology of people and that part. I just want to talk about the language and the effects of it. So if you're saying something is overrated because it's going to create ripples, I think we all understand that. And, we understand when people need to do that. So fine. I'm not even talking about that. Mouse is overrated. Watchmen is overrated. The Beatles are overrated. Citizen Kane is overrated. I mean, we know this. At the same time, there's a group of people, I think, who will say Citizen Kane is overrated or Beatles are overrated, and who'll kind of mean it, and they're not just trying to shock things, and they're talking about a particular context. And I think that's where a lot of things come in, is that what's my expectation? What's my context? What am I coming to something with? And then what did I find? Because I had heard stuff before. So obviously, your reaction to being let down by something that's been built up for you is something that can easily create that the use of the term overrated. But once again, you are talking about something contextual. You're not talking about the work itself. Now, can you say the same thing the other way around? Is if someone says something is bad, and this is where I think here's where I think the distinction, the other third distinction that I'm getting to may lie. If someone says something is overrated, as pointed out in the comments, and as I was saying earlier as well, is that means it's something famous. It means it's something you've already heard of. It's banking on that, and it cannot exist without that. If I was talking about something very niche and very unknown and said that was overrated, I wouldn't quite be using that unless I was completely familiar with the group of people I'm talking to, and we may have a different scale. So if you say overrated, you're talking about something someone already knows. If you're talking about so that means you're saying it's not good, or it's not as good as someone is saying it is. If you're talking about something underrated, you may not be talking about something someone already knows of. And you're not necessarily saying it's not bad. You're not saying it's not that bad as people are saying it is. Overrated could then come back. You could come back and say, it's not that good. It's good, but it's not that good. But my focus still remains on how good do you mean it's not? That's still the focus of what I'm concentrating on, is that reputation. If I say it's not as bad as everyone says it is, as everyone says it is an aside almost. It's not bad is the true focus. This is the most hopeless way of trying to explain this, but the focus of underrated is still the piece of art. Whether it's not as bad as people are saying is an afterthought. The real primary thought is it's worth checking out. It's worth having a conversation about. And that, I think, is basically what I have settled on, is that underrated, even though it sounds like it's about what people think, it's not. It's about the thing. It's about it being good, it being worthwhile, it having something worth checking out. And this is where I think the context would be interesting. So I already said, I've heard people say Watchmen is overrated. I've heard people say Mouse is overrated, although fewer than I've heard people say Watchmen is overrated. What do we mean by that? Or what do they mean by that? What do they mean, as in, I'm not going to try to guess at what their psychology is, but what is it that they wish to communicate? They wish to communicate something about the reputation, but they also wish to communicate that their opinion is different from other people's opinion, which I think is fine and one should. But why the term overrated? It seems a little petulant. It seems as if that is what's bugging you more than the fact that you have actual critique of the work, that you have things to say. And I think that there are different ways of putting it that come close to that. from what people made me expect, I thought it would be this, but I was disappointed to find that instead it was this, and this didn't work for me at all. And I'm just talking very, very subjectively. I'm talking about my own experience, including what people had made me think ahead of time. And it is for my reader or my viewer to judge that experience. We're like, well, his problem was he had high expectations to begin with. Yeah, it makes sense because I put that whole thing into context and I gave you a subjective experience. If I come out of it and say it's overrated, I not only had a subjective experience, I then had a moment of clarity, a pure vision across the world and every other person who had thought this, not just the people who had told me about it, and I delivered a judgment, all in the flash of, or rather the stew that I simmered in, which was the me feeling betrayed by whoever had led me on to think this was great. My reaction to being let down by that reputation now manifests itself in this sort of dismissal. So that's the part that doesn't work for me. That's the part that to me is unappealing, and that's why I call it not just lazy but also arrogant to my ears. All right, so if someone says Watchmen is overrated, I was told it was the best of all comics. I went in expecting a lot and ended up not liking any of it. All right, but I think there are a lot of people out there who think Watchmen is a great comic, including myself, including people in the chat, and other people who are a lot more famous, smart, whatever. But it's not even about credentials or it's not about the number. The point is, are they wrong? Because when someone says it's the best comic, what do they actually mean by that? Do they mean, do we ever, if you come to my channel and I say top 10 science fiction comics or top 10 fantasy comics, do I mean that these are statistically, empirically, scientifically the absolute best 10 science fiction comics there are? I don't think so. I don't think that's the way anyone saying something is the best, something is the number one, best of all time, whatever language they use, I don't think they ever mean that this is the absolute truth. It means, for me, this is the best comic I've ever read. Now you've met 10 people for whom it's the best comic they've ever read. You may have a certain expectation. You may find that expectation to not be fulfilled when you read that work. Maybe part of that disappointment is the expectation. Maybe part of that is absolutely the work itself doesn't work for you, doesn't appeal to you. But overrated means fewer people should like this book. And underrated means more people should like this book. So if you think that fewer people should like Watchmen, what you're reacting to is not just Watchmen, unless you have a sociological, obviously. So I might say that I really hate the fact that this movie is the number one movie of all time because it's such a racist movie. So it being popular to me represents the spreading or the normalization of certain things that I don't like. So I have a sociological sort of reason why I'm resenting. But I still haven't used the term overrated because overrated is now going to talk about the value of it. I've been able to talk about why I am upset about the number of people who like something, and I've been able to give a reason without using the term overrated. So if you don't like something, if I don't like something, and I think this is a good, I don't want to just rag on someone who said that they think Watchmen is overrated. Now, I'm going to turn the camera, already did, on me, and I'm going to talk about two books. And I was trying to find them, obviously, just for. So let's take Frank Miller Batman comics, because I've got two good ones over there. So there's The Dark Knight Returns, and there's Year One, nowadays called Batman Year One. I'm not a fan of The Dark Knight Returns. And those of you who've been around for a while will know this. And those of you who are coming new, I hope you still stick around in spite of that. And I don't necessarily think it's terrible or the worst thing. It's not that. I'm not a fan of The Dark Knight Returns, and I am a super fan of Year One. Now, both of these are extremely famous, extremely enshrined in the canon and in critical history. The Dark Knight Returns possibly has an edge over year one because, as a cultural event and as a milestone and a turning point, it's often cited as being one of the most formative things in American comics. And aside from that, I have now talked with dozens and dozens of people for whom the act of reading that work and the work's impact on them when the first time they read them or when they return to it continues to be something significant. And I myself am able to appreciate a number of different things and not able to appreciate a number of other things. Now, maybe in my younger, foolish days, given the reputation that Batman, The Dark Knight Returns has, and it's a peerless reputation, as in, I mean, it's not to say there aren't people who don't agree with me in my summary of it, but that's not the point. The point is, it's got a tremendous reputation. Now, maybe at some point of time, I could have said it's overrated. I don't know. Maybe I did, when I was young and foolish, and I have no memory of it now, because I'm resentful that I don't get out of it what everybody else gets out of it, or I'm resentful that what everybody else got out of it, I didn't get out of it, or I'm resentful that people built it up for me, or I'm resentful that it built it up, or I'm resentful that the world is so stupid that they think this is art. I don't know. Like, why would I have that reaction to, I could say, I don't know what everybody is talking about. But even that sentence is kind of like as if you've talked to everybody, as if you know every opinion. But again, you're being general. You're like, everybody loves this book. It's not, first of all, true that everybody will love something. And the other thing is, there's no reason to take one's expression out on the people who do. I think it's much more worthwhile to get into why you don't like something and why someone likes something and what are they talking about and what is it that I'm unable to see, and is it actually there as something empirical, or is it something that's about how we read things and translate things, etc. So I wouldn't use, even with my opinion being in general and historically and culturally not quite the majority opinion on this work, I would never use the term overrated anymore. I wouldn't use the term overrated for The Dark Knight Returns. Year One is also a phenomenally famous book. It's been referenced, and there might be some people who say that that is also overrated, because I've heard some people say that, it's not always about that one story and the origin and blah, 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 etc. But it's very famous. It's a very big deal book compared to so many of the comics that we talk about here. It's one of the most famous books. I might still think it's underrated, and I might say it because I've got some sort of contextual comparison between that and a work that I don't like as much as I like that. I might say it because I don't hear enough people talking about it, which is one of the most important things as far as that opinion is concerned. Underrated is usually standing in for underread. And I might also say underrated as in, I think, and this is probably what I'm thinking, is that there's only a certain amount of attention to go around. There's only a certain amount of bandwidth that people have, all the readers in the world and all the audiences in the world. And overrated and underrated somehow becomes our judgment on how much bandwidth something is taking up, which means that automatically, if you're watching this movie, you're not watching that movie. If you're reading this work, you're not reading that other work. And I can understand that inclination. I just don't think that it's as black and white. Things don't necessarily work that way. They don't transfer from one thing to the other directly. There are a whole bunch of other things, and there are some choices. And then you do end up being like, oh, this should be the curated list of the only things you read and the only things you watch. Doesn't make any sense. But when we say underrated, when we say this is worth your time, I think maybe somewhere over there, that's common. It's that if something is underrated, it needs more attention. It needs to be read by more people because I really enjoyed it. And I think more people will enjoy it. I think that's the part of it, which is the hidden part of underrated, where when you're crossing over from the underknown or the unknown into the ratings is you're like, if more people read it, if more people checked it out, more people would like it. The numbers would change. The whole idea of the rating system would start to look very different because something wouldn't be underrated. It would be, as someone said, just appropriately rated. Gore Vidal wants to know if this is all about Saga. It always is. And I think Gore Vidal over here, there's a running joke for those of you who are not familiar, or maybe it's not a joke, maybe it's extremely deadly serious, about what series and what comics different people on YouTube and the comics community like and do not like. And then there are some pet peeves and some things that people really, really dislike. And I think it's a very good question, is how much of that is because it's so popular and because so many other people like it. I still think that it's a natural part of conversation. All I'm talking about really is distinguishing between that cultural conversation about audiences and about storytelling and about economics and distribution and print runs and who has how many theaters and where does the marketing budget of a studio go. All of these conversations about the larger businesses, etc., I think overrated and underrated have different contexts and different suitability. I do want to distinguish that from talking about a work. If we have any opinion on something, it's a personal one. Dismissing anyone else's opinion as simply wrong seems to be not really about wanting to have a conversation or really interested in opinions, even though your entire dismissal seems to be because of opinions. And I don't think underrated dismisses opinions. I don't think underrated dismisses what other people are saying in the same way that overrated dismisses what other people are saying. It's much more inclusive. And here's where my Batman thing comes in. Is just like, why would I say year one is underrated? I would say year one is underrated because, leaving aside social stuff, leaving aside sales and publication and fame, I would just say that, oh, the sleekness and the simplicity hides a much more hard hitting story. It's underrated because it's easy to look at it as just a very sleek action origin story instead of being this much meatier meditation on vigilantism and law and corruption and things like that, because it's like praising something. So my thing of underrated would not be about the social aspects of how famous The Dark Knight Returns is and how famous Year One is. It would be to say that year one, it's like someone saying that The Matrix is underrated because it's not just a great action movie, it's a super bit of philosophical debate or something like that. It's not necessarily my opinion. I'm just saying, it's to say something is underrated is to say that even if it is a big deal, still more praise is needed, or still more analysis can be done, or still more can be celebrated than has already been celebrated. The fact that there is more to read, the fact that there is more to talk about, and the fact that there is more to discuss is really what that term underrated is all about, which is what, for me, makes it the more intriguing thing. If someone says something is overrated, I form an opinion on that person. If someone says something is underrated, I'm now going to be intrigued by what they have to say because they've obviously given it a lot of thought. And that's my judgment on the people. I mean, I'm not saying this is my 100% all the time judgment, but that's the way I look at it, is that someone saying something is overrated, they want to close the conversation or they want to draw attention to themselves, they don't think there's anything else to talk about, that disengages me in a different way than they wanted me disengaged. I don't necessarily think that they have what I'm looking for in a conversation because of their dismissal. And if someone says it's underrated, and I'm like, tell me more. Tell me what you think about it is underrated. Tell me what you've thought about. Tell me what your experience was. And that's such a fundamental difference to these phrases that I see them as being cosmetically similar, but fundamentally very, very different. So, yes, so who would we say is underrated? Someone that not enough people know. That's one thing. Someone that people know, but don't talk about in the same way as they talk about somebody else. I have known a couple of people who felt that Stephen King, the writer, should be talked about in the same way as Philip Roth or John Updike or even more contemporary literary writers. They felt that Stephen King, in spite of being a billionaire several times over, was severely underrated because they were talking about their writing prowess and their literary capabilities, so on and so forth. So, who you say is underrated can be someone that big. It's not necessarily someone who's unknown. And I think the most fascinating, for me, the most fascinating category of underrated is not the people who are unknown, because they're underrated only because they're unknown. If they were known, they would be highly rated, is the way I look at it, because there's a quantitative lack. It's not the people who are very known and who do have a quantitative rank, but not for the right reasons, or they should also be there for some other reasons. People don't give them enough credit for X, Y, and Z. They only give them credit for A, B, and C. Those are the first two categories of underrated. The third category of underrated is the one I think that we'll all, I think agree on, is where there are opinions out there, but you feel as if you alone or you're in the minority who have a better opinion. So the idea being, the ratings exist. It's not as if they're not there. The ratings exist, but when I think about this, I think about books that I have picked up from a bookstore, online, gotten as presents and gifts that I didn't really know about. So I picked them up on impulse or something, and I enjoyed myself when I read it. And then I went online to see what other people had, or I talked to somebody who may have read the work, encountered them somehow, but was surprised that they weren't as positive about what I read as, and that is the part, that is the underrated thing that really interests me. It's not like you don't know who I'm talking about. It's not like you haven't read the work and enjoyed it. You could be someone who really loves James Cameron movies, and I could be like, no, but you just don't get how brilliant he is because, you don't have this technical thing that I do. And you'd be like, no, I already rate him pretty high. I'm like, no, he's still underrated because even you as a fan, so you're neither a fan nor someone who doesn't know. You read something, I read something that you've read, and my opinion of it differed from yours, but you're coming to it from a different point of view. You're not coming to it as getting a recommendation to read something. You've already read it, but you're surprised by the fact that others who have read it did not think as highly of the work as you did. And to me, the reason I find this the most fascinating category is because this is the one that is the most ripe for conversation and the most ripe for, forget the work almost. How do we talk about comics? How do we talk about our personal experiences? How do we talk about craft? How do we talk about storytelling? How do we talk about what makes us very subjective? At the same time, how can we discuss it? If everything is subjective, you'd never be able to communicate. So it's that third category where it's like, how come that didn't work for you the way it worked for me? Or how come it didn't work for me the way it worked for you? That is something that I find to be the underrated comics that I want to talk about, where they will be negative or less than stellar opinions of them out there. And that's kind of the reason to talk about them, is not necessarily to be negative, positive, pros, cons, or pass judgment, is how else do we find out what works for us and what doesn't? Either we can be just used to something that, I'll just get the same thing over and over again. But what I found to be interesting is very often it's the flaws and it's the things that aren't quite polished and smooth and absolutely professional, whether we're talking about writing or art or storytelling, structure, things like that. It's those little fingerprints of humanity that give things their unique flavors. And sometimes the exact reason why you liked something is because of a certain jankiness or a certain handmade quality, to give examples on that. Maybe the reason you liked it because it was so startling and because there was such a shift. Now someone else can say this tone shift just gave me whiplash and I found it very inconsistent, and you could say I loved having the ground being taken away from under my feet and finding myself adrift in this new universe. And both of you are reacting to the same thing. Both of you are talking about the same thing engineered by the same creators in essentially the same manner. It's only your judgment on it or your personal how it affected you that differs. And that's why you can easily talk to people who have differing opinions from you, because it's only about that last one step is I didn't like the whiplash and I love the sense of vertigo. That's what differentiates us. That's all. But we can talk all the way about the shifts of tones. We can talk all about the setup and the characters and the dialogue. And it's the same thing for anything that we disagree on. And that's why when I find comics and when I find books that I find other people online, not only not to have not that many opinions exist, but a lot of these opinions are made up by other people who just picked something up not knowing what they were going to read. So when I look on Goodreads or when I come across the occasional Amazon review, the Amazon reviews, not so much. There's a lot of nonsense out there because people don't know that they're buying a comic and then they're surprised they got a comic in the mail. So I ignore those kind of reviews. But I've looked on Goodreads and I've read some good reviews and some negative reviews that I think are very well articulated. And then there are others that are simply, this is what worked for me and this isn't. And they've got a star numbering system, and a lot of places use the star numbering systems, and it makes it an easy thing to focus on when talking about things like overrated or underrated. If you look at a number, you're looking at something numerical and you're like, 3.5? That doesn't make sense for this book. I mean, like, why do you have a star rating for it? I'm like, no, I don't, but I wouldn't give it a 3.5. I don't have a 5.5 or 4.5, but all I know is it's not a 3.5. So I've gone from someone who doesn't believe in having a 5-star scale or a numerical score, etc., to believing it so much that I resent the number that's over there. So it's that part that I think when I talk about underrated comics is what I'll want to talk about. So the conclusion, because I knew this was going to be a short live stream, the conclusion to what I've been talking about all this while is that I actually, and this is getting back to the comment I was making about where this video came from, I wanted to make a video on 3 underrated comics. And then the 3 comics I picked, well, first of all, I got 2, and then I just couldn't get a third one. And I couldn't figure out why I kept saying, no, that's not underrated, or that's not underrated. And yeah, there's not a lot of underrated stuff, but because the contexts are different. Someone said, I think Paco Roca is an underrated artist. I'm like, yeah, but not to me. I mean, I rate him very highly, and I've made a couple of videos, and I've shown a number of Paco Roca books, and I know other people who are big fans of Paco Roca and have either read 1 or 2 or all of his works, etc. So my context is completely different. Now, do I think that more people should read Paco Roca? I mean, sure. So he's underread, and that automatically makes him underrated. Then there are some people who have read some Paco Roca books and not like them as much as others. And these are conversations that we, I don't like them all equally. And I have my favorites and things like that. And over there, and I'll get back to this later, I'm just putting a little check over there. But the context matters. So if I think any of the books that I've ever talked about on this channel, including my shelf videos, is like, what do I mean by underrated? Because somewhere out there are people who love this work, and I know that they're out there. So what am I exactly talking about? So I've had to, I think, say what I'm talking about is books that people have read but don't talk about very positively, or it seems more like opinion is split. There isn't a clear consensus on whether something is good or not. And I had a tough time finding such books. I mean, part of the reason is that only people who are very, very disappointed by something and read quite a lot, or someone who loved something is going to go online and rate it. So it might be skewed a little. What I was going to say is I did think of a funny sort of context in which I might use or might have used overrated. And it's a very specific context because I would only do it with a closed group of works by the same creator, which is also the only time I would think about ranking works because I'm only going to talk about the context of the creator. And a friend of mine once said, where he says, it's like saying Dancing Queen by ABBA is overrated because that's the only song everyone knows. And this was many, many years ago, so I'm not even sure if that's true or not. But that's the same thing as the awards, that if there is one song that hit number one, you're like, well, that's the one that everyone knows. That's the one that was on radio, and that's the one. But there are so many other songs that are so much better on their albums, etc. You can say this about all musicians of groups, bands that you like. And so this idea of overrated and underrated within a particular oeuvre, I think, is an interesting thing to play with. So when you look at all the Tintins, for example, you will hear certain Tintins be called out as people's favorites. I can tell you which ones are people's favorites just because people have left so many comments on these videos. And there are some, the Blue Lotus, the Secret of the Unicorn, these are Tintin in Tibet. These come up on many, many people's lists. They come up as a number one all the time. Some poor person like me, who's really, really resentful of how badly Tintin and the Picaros gets treated in all these conversations. I was like, well, that's overrated and this is underrated. So I'm really trying to talk only to Tintin fans and only to people who've sat down and made a list, and then I'm trying to get into about why we want to be, that's the kind of persnickety list stuff that is different, I think, from dismissal. That's really an engagement of a different kind where, well, I'll watch someone's list video and say, well, I wouldn't put that at number 4 and I wouldn't put that on the top 10 at all. And that one is a lot higher than I thought it would be. That's part of the conversation. So I think if I said a particular, and I'm not going to say this about any of the Tintin comics, but if I said, within all of Alan Moore's work, this is overrated and this is underrated. Or I could say this is underrated because everyone always talks about this, but they don't talk about that. Everyone always talks about Watchmen, but nobody talks about Halo Jones, that kind of stuff. We're getting back to that bandwidth issue, that the idea that there's only so much attention that can be given. There's only so much attention that can be paid. There's only so much conversation that can be had. And this is wasting precious ink, precious oxygen, putting something on a wheelbarrow or whatever that is already pretty loaded up. It doesn't need your oxygen. You don't need to continue. That is overrating. Put it somewhere else. That might be the way it goes. But I really do think that idea is again central to my distinction between these terms. Is that what are we talking about? Since I want to talk about books, and I know that most of us want to talk about books, I would love to talk about underrated comics, and I would love to hear what people's underrated picks are, by which I mean not people who should be read more or more people should know them, but where you think that people have kind of missed the point, or not missed the point because I might be arrogant, but there's a little bit more than what people think there is, or there are things that you can add that would maybe change the way people look at something. That's the kind of underrated book that I think we end up calling hidden gems, not just things that were unknown, but things that didn't get their due. But the way things go is that if something is good, at some time or the other, it will get its due. It might be 100 years after the creators have passed away and things like that, but it happens all the time. So keeping that conversation alive, keeping that idea that something may not have been critically or commercially successful when it first came out, and that is the reputation it had until it was a different reputation, until enough people said it was underrated for it now to become something that's part of the literary canon. That's the kind of conversation I think I'm interested in. So all of this is to kind of contextualize that if I make videos on underrated gems, and that's what underrated means. So I'm not going to spend all this time at the beginning of those videos. If I make them, I'll just point to this live stream's recording and say, go check that out for why and what I mean when I mean underrated gems. Question. Would love to know then about your list of hidden gems graphic novels. Excellent question, which is exactly what I was thinking that I am going to make stuff about. But I think I myself have to do a little bit more reading, and I have to understand my parameters a little bit more. When I was looking through my shelves, as I said, I found it difficult to say what's a hidden gem. And this is a unique problem because I've got a lot of people who tell me I'd never heard of this comic until I saw your video. But there are so many people who know so much about so much more than what I know that it seems almost like if I say this is a hidden gem, there's very easily so many experts around here who can come up and say, oh, that's not a hidden gem. That won that award over there, and it's been taught at this university forever, and there's this entire community. I mean, and they'd be right. So what is a hidden gem for which context always becomes a tough thing. And therefore, I'll just make a video on something that I like. And then there'll be some people who'll say, I never knew that existed. And some other people who'll say, welcome to the club. Now you know what I've known for the last 20 years. And I like getting both of those things. So if I make Usagi Yojimbo and someone hasn't heard of Usagi Yojimbo, and I get a scholar on Usagi Yojimbo enjoying the same video, I mean, I think that's great. So what is a hidden gem will need a little bit more contextualization. And that's what I think I'll do is if I call something a hidden gem, it'll be something that I went online and looked at reviews and thought those reviews were a little lower than what I would have thought something like this would deserve. So it would have to be sort of a finding out afterwards, or maybe in some cases it'll be a book that people told me to avoid, that for some perverse reason I didn't avoid and end up enjoying it, which I think there are not that many of. So it'll most probably be the first one. Sleepy Reader says, I always get nervous calling creators geniuses, almost instantly becomes overrated. Yes. And I think calling someone a genius is one of those tough things. I think in a genius move, a genius couple of pages, a genius twist to the narrative, if I apply it to things that the creator has created, it seems to me that I can give a nice little sideways, a little bit of deflection, basking in the glory of that adjective being applied to something else, but because they created that something else. So it's sort of, saying there was a stupid thing to do without calling someone stupid. It's sort of the opposite of that. But yes, I think if you hear someone else call someone a genius, you should investigate what they think of as a genius and why, rather than take that as an automatic assumption that you should and will love the person that they're talking about. So if someone says Chris Ware is a genius, someone can say Chris Ware is overrated. And it's like, what do they mean by that? It says, well, I heard he was a genius and I read his work and I didn't think he was a genius. So you're like, well, are you overrated at the... I mean, do you mean then anytime the word genius is used, it has the potential of being overrated? Of course. So if you say, do I only mean IQ? What do I mean by it? And I think that's where we get into the expectations of. I think more people are like, why was this person called a genius? Well, because the other guy wanted to call him a genius. Go take it up with him. Don't take it out on the world and say this is overrated. Go ask the people who said he was a genius of why, and they'll probably have some good reasons why. And I think that's where I find the fun part of the conversations to be. I want more people talking about the comic. Yeah, exactly. That's really what we are talking about anyway. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for being along for this rambling little conversation. As I was saying earlier, this isn't because, something happened or someone said something. It's just something that I thought of, and I hadn't been online for a while for various reasons, and I thought it would be fun to have this conversation. I love having your comments over here. Any that I have missed, I will go over. If you're watching this in recorded form later, I'd love to have your comments below as well. And let's see, maybe the next video I make will be on a couple of hidden gems, underrated gems. Who knows? This has been For the Love of Comics. Thank you so much for watching.